Good morning and a warm welcome to this morning's online Llafur event. I'm Ian Rees, Chair of Llafur, the Welsh People's History Society. Today's session is a continuation of Llafur's spring series on migration in Wales. As I know many of you are already aware, the series is being dedicated to the memory of Llafur President Hywel Francis, who died in February. One quick housekeeping issue. Can I please just remind you all to ensure your microphones are turned off during this morning's event? Thank you. A brief plug before we get this morning's session underway. This week marks the launch of Llafur's new essay competition, the Ieuan Gwynedd Jones Essay Prize. Entry is open to all previously unpublished authors, and essays of between 6,000 and 8,000 words are invited on any aspect of Welsh social or cultural history. Entries can be in English or Welsh and should be submitted to the Llafur editors by the end of June 2021. The winning essay will be published in the Llafur Journal, and its author will receive a prize of £100 and a year's free membership of Llafur. I do hope there will be audience members here this morning who might consider entering, and do spread the word to others who may be interested. Right, on to today's session. Following on from last week's event on the Congo Institute and its students, which kicked off part 2 of our series on global connections and transnational exchange, our theme for this morning is religion and liberty. The association between religious orthodoxy and liberty of thought has often been a controversial one. In a global context, religious missionaries and communities such as the Jesuits and Quakers, both individually and collectively, were often actively positioned at the crosspoint of this sometimes fraught relationship. Today's guest speakers, Richard Allen and Hannah Thomas, are here to pick apart this fluid and inconsistent process from the individual to the transnational. To chair this morning's session, great pleasure to introduce Erin Bell. Erin Bell is Senior Lecturer at the University of Lincoln. Her research focuses on early Quakerism and on links between the Friends, Quakers, and other religious minorities in the 17th century through to the 19th century. She also researches representations of the past, primarily on television and memory, considering the accounts which are absent as well as those which do appear. Erin, delighted you're able to be with us this morning. Many thanks for chairing today's event. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ian. I hope people can hear me. It's a delight. I'm very excited about the papers we're going to hear. They look absolutely brilliant. And it's a real honour as well to be asked to chair this. So thank you very much. So I've been asked to offer an introduction. It is the classic no introduction is needed, but I have been asked to offer an introduction for both of our speakers. So if I start with Richard Allen, well, what can I say? I've known Richard for many, many years, and he's an all-round good egg, but additionally, he's a fantastic scholar. He's a scholar of a variety of things, but including Quakerism, Welsh Quakerism, and this is what he's going to be talking about today. As a bit of a background, bit of biog for Richard, he's obviously interested in the history of Quakerism. He's also interested in, geographically more widely, Welsh Quakers in America, in particular as emigrants and in particular in Pennsylvania, but not solely. He's also interested in Quakerism in Northeast England, and I mean, more broadly, he's written around cultural history and history of religion. He's currently a fellow at Woodbrook College in Birmingham. He's also a visiting research fellow at the Australian National University and at Newcastle University in the UK. And he was, a few years ago, the Fulbright Professor of British History, which is a very prestigious kind of post that he held for a year. He's also published 5 books, and I could say, what else does he need to do? But he's obviously still working, he's obviously still writing, he's doing an awful lot. And we also, as our second speaker, if I kind of pull these together, we also have Hannah Thomas, who and I find this fascinating. He's based at the Bar Convent. Because as a lowly undergraduate, I did research at the Bar Convent, and it's a wonderful, wonderful resource in the city of York. So it's fantastic to see someone doing such fascinating research is also based at the Bar Convent. Brilliant. She's a research associate in Renaissance and Early Modern Studies at the University of York. And she's the special collections manager of the Bar Convent. She's got a PhD in researching early modern Jesuit libraries, which just sounds amazing to me, really, really fascinating. And more broadly, she's thought about Jesuit intellectual and physical exchanges between England, I hope I've got this right, Hannah, between England and the rest of Europe. Sounds amazing stuff, really, really interesting. So I'm very excited about this. And I hope that people listening to these papers are as excited as I am, because I think it sounds absolutely fascinating. So what we're going to do, I've given my brief introduction. We'll have Richard's paper, then Hannah's paper, but please, please, please put questions in the chat if you'd like to, because that's a really good way to kind of put a steer on the sort of additional material that you'd like our speakers to talk about, obviously that relate to their papers. And really it's just me kind of fielding that. So please, as an audience, please do put questions in the chat. Brilliant. So thank you to our speakers. And I'd like to, if it's all right with Richard, I'd like to pass over to you now, Richard.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see so many people at this event. I'll try now to screen share, and hopefully this will work. Sorry, you've got the wrong thing here. I'll try it again. When we did this beforehand, it worked perfectly. I can't see my paper anywhere, my PowerPoint anywhere on the screen, so I'm going to try to do it again. And hopefully this time it will come up. I do apologize for this. I still can't see it.
Do you want to swap them around? Do you want me to go first while Richard's trying to find his paper?
Would you mind? Because it definitely was there beforehand.
Erin, is that okay with you? Yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
Sorry about this.
Don't worry. Okay, right. Morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for that introduction as well, Erin. So I'm going to be talking about Catholics in Wales today. So the impression created by the existing historiography on Catholics in Wales and the early modern history of Catholicism in Wales is that post-Reformation Catholicism was insignificant and of fairly minimal importance. Catholicism in Wales is assumed to have died out quite rapidly after Elizabeth I took the throne, with the final blow being dealt by the successful scaremongering and the chaos caused by the Popish plot in the late 1670s. However, this is simply not the case. And in fact, there is evidence that suggests that there existed in Wales a strong and thriving Catholic community in Wales and the Marches from at least the latter years of Elizabeth's reign right the way through until the mid-18th century and beyond. So although not legally distinct from England, Wales and Welsh Catholicism is a different thing to English Catholicism. It has a unique identity culturally and of course linguistically as well. So Wales had established itself as a Catholic stronghold very quickly after the religious changes of the mid to late 16th century. Let me just share my screen. And as early as 1572, Maurice Clunog, a Welsh Catholic exile and author, asserted that as the Israelites awaited the Messiah, so too the Welsh awaited the restoration of Catholicism. Furthermore, Clunog wrote to Pope Gregory XIII in 1575, as you can see on screen there, that despite Wales being a third of the size of England, quote, there is in it scarcely one man in 1,000 who is a heretic, i.e. a Protestant. For the Welsh are the original inhabitants of the island, a people who retain their own ancient language and the Catholic faith of their fathers, though they no longer dare to hear mass or hold publicly other things proper to the Catholic faith. Welsh Catholicism in these early days had a distinctly militant flavour, and in many ways was underpinned by strong currents of tension between the Welsh and the English. And this was manifest itself in the well-known struggle for control of the Venerable English College in Rome in the Lent of 1579, which is an ancient institution with a long, interesting history that we haven't got time to go into today, which was completely revitalized as a result of Clunog's missionary zeal in the 1570s, and of which he was appointed first rector in 1578. So ultimately, there were tensions between the Welsh and the English. Clunog was accused of favouring the Welsh students over the English students, which has often been framed as kind of the Welsh versus English trope that we're also familiar with. But actually, the episode provides a valuable glimpse into the minds and motives of Welsh Catholics in this period, particularly revealing that they viewed the Welsh church as something distinct from the English church. And a key point of difference between the factions in Rome was a debate about the best way to deal with these religious changes that the Reformation had ushered in. The English students favoured a more modern counter-Reformation approach, so the new kind of missionary techniques espoused by the Society of Jesus, in contrast with the Welsh students who pushed for a more conservative approach. They preferred the college to train men for suitable occupations on the continent, where they could maintain a low profile and remain safe until what they saw as the inevitable return of England and Wales to Catholicism. So initially then, Jesuit ideals and missionary techniques were seen as being somewhat anti-Welsh. So following the foundation of the Society of Jesus, who are also known as the Jesuits, by Ignatius Loyola in 1540, the main aim of the society was to be unenclosed and to be free to go wherever God called them to do their work. So in complete contrast to the more traditional idea of a monastery or a religious idea, where they're contained within a monastery and quite restricted in terms of the structure of the day, the Jesuits didn't want any of that. They wanted to be completely free to go wherever God was calling them. So the order grew quite rapidly, and within just 25 years, there were 3,500 members, all engaged in a wide variety of missionary and educational activities around the world. And by 1773, they had founded 700 schools and universities around the world. So the order is still in operation today and is the largest religious order in the Catholic Church, numbering some 12,000 members, active in approximately 112 countries worldwide. So from its base in Rome, the Jesuits decided to establish a mission to post-Reformation England and Wales, with the aim of secretly ministering to and supporting the hidden Catholic community, and to enable the survival of the faith through those turbulent times. This was the Society's first independent permanent mission, and although it was launched in 1580, this mission had taken some years of negotiation, and in fact, the strength of support for Catholicism in Wales, despite the penal laws in force at that time, was one of the key reasons cited for encouraging the mission in the first place. And it was one of the main arguments that eventually persuaded Jesuit Superior General Everard Mercurian to sanction the mission in 1580, after a long few years of trying to persuade him to go ahead with this. So this initial mission ended with what could be seen as disastrous consequences, most notably the execution of Edmund Campion. It was a successful starting point for the Jesuits, and numbers of missioner priests working throughout England and Wales grew exponentially throughout the next 40 years, culminating in the official creation of the English and Welsh province in 1623. So Wales was one of 3 missionary areas targeted by the Jesuits in these early years. It was chosen for strength of adherence to Catholicism. So 3 areas were London, Lancashire, which I think we hear a lot about in post-Reformation history as being a Catholic centre and Wales. So those were the three main areas that were targeted. And they functioned as a pilot test for a wider national missionary focus, which eventually then built up to the province establishment in 1623. And as well as the Jesuits, there were also a small number of secular priests and Benedictine missioners at work in Wales. So following the creation of the English province in 1623, England and Wales was divided into districts to enable efficient administration and distribution of the missioners, while still allowing operations to remain largely undetected. So as you can see, the geographical districts, the names of them, they correspond broadly to counties, but each one is given the name of a particular saint so that they could be referred to in correspondence without giving away their location. So you might write, Dear Thomas when you're writing to the house in Hampshire, or you might write, to Thomas from Mary if you're writing from Hampshire to Oxfordshire, for example. So each district is also designated a college or a residence, and this refers to their financial stability. Districts with secure annual incomes, and therefore the support of local Catholics, were termed colleges governed by a rector, and those with less secure incomes were termed residences. They were living more on donations, a bit less stable, and they were governed by a superior. And this is a unique Jesuit response to the difficult conditions created in post-Reformation England and Wales. So from the 1580s onwards, it's important to remember it's a treasonable offence to be a Catholic priest, to publish Catholic books, or to help the Catholic community in any way. So if you're caught doing these things, enabling the faith, being part of that faith, there are really strict penalties, from financial penalties right the way up to the loss of life if it's a treasonable offence. So in Wales, the arrival of the Jesuit Robert Jones in February 1595 signalled the end of those simmering anti-Jesuit tensions I mentioned at the beginning, perhaps providing a clue to his selection for this mission in the first place, I think. So Jones operated under at least 10 aliases. So the fact that he has 10 gives you some sense of the level of danger this work could involve. And he was later appointed head of the entire English and Welsh mission in 1609. He was sent directly to Wales from Rome in 1595 with the aim of establishing this Welsh district that we can see on the screen. He was born near Chirk in North Wales, and quite likely a first language Welsh speaker. And I suspect his proactive missionary zeal in his homeland and his ability to speak to people in their own language helped to soothe those ruffled feathers after the tensions that we saw in Rome, and also helped to shift perceptions away from this feeling that Jesuit missionary techniques were somehow inherently anti-Welsh. So Jones was based within the Territorial College of St. Francis Xavier, which is the yellow area you can see on the map there. It's a huge missionary territory, and it's the most extensive district of the province, as you can see, covering until 1667 the whole of Wales, Herefordshire, Monmouthshire, Somerset and Gloucestershire, which is about 30,000 square kilometres. So even after 1667, when for practical reasons the area was divided in half and the residence of St Winifred created in North Wales, which is number 11 on the map there. So the College of St Francis Xavier, which is now South Wales and Herefordshire, so the green area on the map, is still a fairly extensive district of the province, covering some 20,000 kilometres in its reduced size. So headquarters of this large territorial district are at the Cwm estate, which is marked by this little dot here just above the River Severn. And I will return to the significance of this location later. So Robert Jones was closely involved with the selection and successful use of the missionary headquarters at the Cwm estate, which was established by 1615. He helped to develop an extensive missionary library that was built up from 1600 onwards. And his close links with and patronage by the very wealthy and powerful Somerset family, the Earls of Worcester, who were based at Raglan Castle, particularly Edward Somerset, the fourth Earl, ultimately provided the financial security that allowed the Missio Walier to be developed into this new College of St. Francis Xavier by 1623. So Jones was active in establishing, he organised the Welsh gentry, he organised the secular priests, and the network of Jesuits working within Wales. And within a decade of his arrival, so by 1604, this network was sufficiently robust to allow Welsh students to be safely sent from Wales and the borders to be trained at the English colleges at Valladolid and Dewi. So the practicalities of arranging that kind of transport and that kind of movement of people speak to a very well-established, secure network of people that can circumvent the legal restrictions in place at the time. So the Earl of Worcester, excuse me, the Earls of Worcester, who are now the Dukes of Beaufort, they still exist, and they're now resident at Badminton House in Gloucestershire. They claimed descent back to John of Gaunt and a close kinship with the Tudor monarchy. The fourth Earl, who I mentioned, was a particular favourite of Elizabeth I and James I. He lived a highly successful, publicly very Protestant life across both of those reigns. He held lots of powerful positions. He was on the Privy Council, a very visible public Protestant. But privately, however, he remained a Catholic. And he was allegedly described by Queen Elizabeth herself as, quote, reconciling the irreconcilable, a stiff papist with a good subject. And Somerset's close working relationship with Robert Jones was at the heart of the Welsh Catholic network. So in or about 1595, so soon after Jones's arrival, his patron, William Morgan of Llantarnam, who he married the Earl of Worcester's daughter, Frances, and these four together provided the land and financial security necessary for the establishment of the College of St. Francis Xavier. And similarly in North Wales, the protection of the Herbert family at Powys Castle, who were closely connected to the Somersets by marriage, was vital to the continued success of Catholic missionary endeavour in Wales, particularly at Holywell and at least 3 other missionary bases in the northern half of the college. There's Welshpool with nearby Powys Castle, Plowden Hall in Shropshire, as you can see on the map there. So virtually no evidence survives at all of any of these networks, these places. There's very little evidence in the places themselves or of the Welsh Catholic community more broadly. But one key source that does provide vital evidence is the extensive missionary library that I mentioned at the beginning. So this was built up by the Jesuits working within Wales from 1595 onwards. And although it was seized during a raid of the Cwm estate in December 1678, as a result of that raid and seizure of the books, many of the books were taken to Hereford Cathedral, where they survived in an unknown number, in unknown places, pretty much unknown by anybody, apart from 1 or 2 scholars, until my own research began in 2011. So before I move on to talk about those books in more detail, I just want to draw your attention to an important point, and that is the choice of location. So I mentioned that the Cwm estate, which you can see marked on the map there, is down in this bottom corner. And as you can see from the map, these missionary bases are in a slightly odd position given this vast geographical territory, particularly when you remember that the Cwm estate is the main location. It's not particularly accessible even with modern transport and modern roads. It's really difficult to get to. And I think the key thing to remember here is the importance of proximity to borders. So in 17th century religious history in England and Wales, borders are key. Methods of law enforcement that are in place at the time are organised according to geographical boundaries, so such as parishes, counties, and therefore jurisdiction is only obtained within those specific areas. So if you're a community of Jesuits covertly ministering to a large recusant population, the ability to quickly pass over into another county, a nearby county, or in this case, in the Welsh borderlands, into a different country, provides a measure of security against the dangerous work being undertaken. It's a 17th century insurance policy of sorts. So by the time anyone in pursuit reaches the main town of the next county, if somebody sees you near the border in Monmouthshire, for example, and then you go over into Herefordshire, they have to go to Hereford, alert the relevant authorities and get them to come back to where they'd seen you doing whatever illegal thing you were doing, by which time obviously you've long gone. And in Wales in particular, the potential linguistic differences between English and Welsh border towns adds an extra element of delay and confusion and just creates a little bit more opportunity to escape. And interestingly, all of these bases you can see on the map there are also within close proximity to Church of England diocesan borders. So this is an additional, something we're not particularly familiar with in the modern time, but in the early modern periods, the diocesan authority is an equally powerful authority to that of the county authorities. And they similarly have strict jurisdictional divides. So it suggests that the Jesuits had a very keen awareness of these lines and used local knowledge to their advantage to locate their positions accordingly. If you've ever been to the Cwm itself is in England, and Wales is literally at the bottom of the garden, so you can literally hop over the garden fence, and you're in a completely different territory. So with all that in mind, I just want to spend the rest of the time this morning looking at some of the evidence from within those library books to look at what this reveals about the Welsh Catholic community more widely. So we're talking about approximately 340 books. When I started the research, it was about 130. And through going through the whole library and finding other evidence, it's increased to about 340 now. I'm reluctant to say it's a final number because every time I do, I get a phone call to say somebody's found another one in the cathedral somewhere. So it's about 340 books. And these books particularly reveal hidden aspects of Catholic life in post-Reformation England and Wales. Particularly noticeable is the truly international nature of Catholic life in 17th century Wales. The surviving books date from 1503 to 1676, although primarily after 1595. And they are published all over Europe in places such as Rome, Paris, Antwerp, Liège, Munich, Ingolstadt, Toledo, and Douai. So caution is required, as obviously the date of printing doesn't necessarily mean date of acquisition. But generally, these books are being printed consistently throughout the period of the most intensive missionary activity in Wales, from 1595 to 1676. I think it's reasonable to assume, therefore, that these books are being constantly purchased on the continent and smuggled into Wales continuously through this period. So I think far from this perception that we might have of Wales being isolated and being a secluded backwater of Britain, Catholics in Wales remain deeply connected with their European counterparts and with a shared continental Catholic culture. And an important question to address here is the practicality of exactly how these books made their way from the continent into Wales in the 17th century. And the most likely possibility here is the patronage and support of the Somerset family, who I mentioned earlier. They held various powerful and influential positions, particularly admirals of the Severn, which meant they had full control over all shipping in and out of the Severn. They were Lords Lieutenant of Glamorganshire and Monmouthshire, and they were Admiral of the Narrow Sea. So effectively, the person who was the authority for protecting things that came in and out of Britain via the River Severn. So you can see how they might be able to use this position to facilitate the safe transportation of volumes from various printing centres around Europe into Wales. The location of their second seat is at Chepstow Castle. If you've been there, it's right on the river. You can, I think if the tide is right, you can sail a boat pretty much up the River Severn directly into the castle itself. So you can see how if you're trying to get illegal Catholic texts into Wales and you'll happen to be in control of a castle that's got that option, and you happen to own all the land that all the Catholics are pretty much living on and working in, you could very easily use those positions to get your books in. And it also completely circumvents, so the English authorities are aware of the likelihood for smuggling books in, and they are very watchful in ports such as London and Dover. But things like the port of the River Severn is completely off their radar. So being able to use that position of authority completely circumvents the authorities that are in position to stop that kind of activity happening. So these books are connecting Welsh Catholics with the theology, ideas, and spirituality of their continental counterparts. They are also fulfilling a spiritual need for the Welsh Catholic community, allowing lay Catholics to function as part of a wider religious community. Evidence from within the volumes, there's just some examples on the screen there, such as inscriptions, provenance, and ownership marks, demonstrate that the books are widely circulated amongst the Welsh Catholic community. And surviving examples illustrate a strong and thriving community. You often get more than one inscription on one book, showing it's being passed around from person to person, and a flourishing tradition of book sharing and circulation. And this is in direct contravention of the 1606 Act to Prevent and Avoid Dangers which may grow by Popish recusants, which, amongst other things, specifically mentioned that it was illegal to buy or sell Catholic books. Such literature was potentially so dangerous that the Act even differentiated between books published in different languages. So those caught importing, printing, buying or selling books written in English were to be seized, and the perpetrator fined 40 shillings per book. So there is an interesting loophole there as well for books printed in Welsh, for example, because the authorities are focused on English and on it being the language of the lay people, so therefore having a greater spread and a greater impact. But there's perhaps an interesting loophole there for Welsh language books. And there are lots of examples on screen there. So there, if you're familiar with any aspect of Welsh Catholicism, there's some familiar names there. There's the Gunters of Abergavenny, the Ravenhills of Hereford, the Pointses of Iron Acton, and various other names. And on the bottom left, this one here, the beautiful Gothic writing, that I think is William Morgan of Llantarnam, the patron of Robert Jones. And Anselmus, just above it, is one of Robert Jones's aliases. So this is one of the books that we know was being shared between Robert Jones, the Jesuit, and his lay Catholic patron. And the Cwm books also, there are also more subtle forms of ideological identity within the books. There are sketches of praying figures, fragments of prayers, and other means of using these books as a physical link between a scattered community for a spiritual and devotional life. And the circulation of books also allows a priest, a missioner, priest, or a Jesuit to extend far beyond their physical reach. So when you think that vast territory we were just looking at, we're talking of between probably 8 and 12 priests at any one time working within that territory. So they just physically couldn't be present in many places at any one time. But leaving a book with somebody, they could continue their spiritual development. So you could leave a book, ask them to read particular exercises or particular paragraphs, and then when the priest returns, the spiritual conversation and development can continue. Manuscript material found within the collection also points to the practicalities of achieving this spiritual guidance under difficult missionary conditions. So this is a manuscript book, which I've termed a spiritual commonplace book, because there's not very many examples of these in the world. This is a very rare manuscript example of Ignatian spirituality being used in England and Wales. So this is an internally produced guide, so written by the Jesuits themselves, for presenting a version of the Jesuit spiritual exercises, so Ignatius's spiritual exercises. And this is them in a very practical 8-day format, broken up into small sections which could be worked on sort of one bit at a time. So you can see here, this is on the first day, this is a brief summary of the type of things to think about. And then the Lectio section underneath is some further reading to do in between. So if you're only able to visit once every few months, you can leave this with somebody and the appropriate reading. They can focus on the reader material and the spiritual development, and then come back to the next section next time you're able to visit. So this is written by Jesuits within the College of St. Francis Xavier and circulated widely amongst the community. And a lot of the bits under the Lectio also have got fairly kind of familiar short names of books, suggesting that perhaps maybe the Cwm functioned as a reading space itself as well. So perhaps when things were a bit less difficult for Catholics, you were able to visit the library physically and borrow the books possibly. I think the books also demonstrate that the various individuals that make up the Welsh Catholic community consciously identify themselves as part of one community, albeit one that is geographically scattered throughout the Principality. So you can see on the slide there, a number of books bear these Welsh devotional mottos, which say "Do a digon." So you can see "Do a digon" in a few different hands and in a few different places within the books, which is sort of God is plenty, God is enough, loosely translated, and also heb Dyw, heb ddim, which is sort of without God, without anything. And as you can see, it's written by a number of different people, a number of different ways, and often very carefully positioned so as to avoid attention. So you can see on this one, for example, it's very carefully tucked in amongst the other text, so it's not particularly visible unless you know what you're looking for. So although these inscriptions are anonymous, variations of these phrases do appear in other parts of the Welsh Catholic community. The Welsh Catholic families, such as the Stradlings of St Donats in Glamorganshire, they use a version of this as their family motto, and the Vaughan family of Courtfield also use a version of Dyw a Digon for their family motto. An evidence of use of these phrases in material culture. So, for example, the baptismal font at Tregear Parish, very near to Raglan Castle, somebody has carved Dyw a Digon on this IHS symbol into the base of the font. This is a 19th century pen drawing of the carving, but you can see that it suggests that this phrase is very widely known and used, and is a sort of a badge of identity amongst the Welsh Catholics, and is a very familiar one to them. But outside of that group, perhaps not so obvious, what it is. It's a very discreet way of expressing a community identity. And incidentally, Denbighshire County Council also used Dyw a Digon as their council motto. I'm not really sure why. I'd like to know more about that. So I think that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the Welsh Catholic community in Wales. There is obviously a lot more to say, but hopefully you can see that there's a distinct identity, there's a sense of a community, there's a Welsh Catholic community different from that of English Catholic community or other areas. There's a clear sense of them identifying as a community together and links with each other, and a spiritual life underpinned by a robust Jesuit missionary network. And this is a continuously strengthened relationship with fellow Catholics across Europe via the discreet circulation of appropriate reader material. And all facilitated via this vital network of patronage and protection and use of the geographical local landscapes to ensure that they're able to continue this vital religious work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannah. I think that was amazing, and certainly in the chat people are saying, yeah, this is absolutely fascinating, this is a tour de force, brilliant. So it was absolutely fascinating. Can I suggest, if people have questions, obviously please put them in the chat. We're going to have Richard's paper now, hopefully, and then we can sort of draw the questions together after we've heard the two speakers. But that was absolutely fantastic. There's some amazing material there. Thank you so much. Richard, are you okay to go, do you think?
I think so. I thought for a while then that this was the first time that dissent had been silenced. So this might be a hidden history instead. Thank you very much, all of you, for putting up with me and my Luddism. The Religious Society of Friends, commonly called Quakers, had their origins in 1653, when John ap John of Denbighshire became convinced after hearing George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, speak at Swarthmore Hall in the northwest of England. On his return, ap John established the first Quaker meeting near his house, and thereafter, alongside English Quaker missionaries, both male and female, he would proclaim the Quaker message throughout Wales. Few people in 17th century Wales could conceive of their lives without religion. It provided hope, comfort, and identity. Ap John and his fellow Quakers certainly endorsed this view, while their experiences during the worst years of persecution from 1660 onwards sorely tested their commitment to their chosen religious community. As a separate people, they practiced their beliefs in opposition to the state authorities, as well as local secular and religious leaders. Predictably, Quakers were classed as dangerous subversives who were heretical and blasphemous. They challenged religious orthodoxy by insisting on their intimate relationship with God, in which he spoke directly to them. There was no need for a priest or a minister. And consequently, between 1653 and 1659, there were at least 17 separate acts under which a Quaker could be charged and punished. Quakers were subjected to crippling fines, public whippings, verbal abuse, imprisonment in dreadful conditions. What I, however, propose this morning is not to dwell on this earlier period, but rather to consider the level of hostility towards them in the post-Restoration period, so post-1660, and then after the introduction of the so-called Act of Toleration in 1689, before finally turning attention to Welsh Quaker emigrants and the wider question of liberty and equality for all, and particularly the issue of slavery. So in the opening section, I'm going to address these three questions. It is estimated that from their origins to the introduction of the Act of Toleration in 1689, 15,000 Quakers in Britain were punished under a variety of laws. There are numerous examples throughout Wales from 1660 onwards where their adversaries sought revenge for the past 18 years of warfare, republicanism, and religious fanaticism as they saw it. Consequently, Quakers came under attack from church and secular leaders and the wider public. So why would you become a Quaker? If we take the view of John Moon, there was an opportunity to come out of the religious darkness, to abandon the false promises of the clergy, and to embrace a new religious beginning. Quite literally, to turn traditional worship around. And here I've given you a graphic from 1648, where you have the Orthodox true minister, and then the dissenting minister, the seducer and false prophet. Now think about that image and simply turn it around. The Orthodox true minister would thereby become the seducer and false prophet, while the Quakers would provide the true religious way going forward. For some, including Thomas Wynne of Flintshire, it was an obvious choice, but nevertheless, it was a hazardous choice. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 certainly did not provide any respite for dissenters. This was despite the Declaration of Breda of April 1660, when Charles II offered a general pardon for those who had sided with Parliament during the civil wars or had been in power during the interregnum. Well, he would offer them a pardon so long as they recognized him as their lawful king and would swear the oath of allegiance. For many, they could not do this. Alongside this was also the prospect of religious toleration for dissenters. But sharp words did not go with long memories, and within the year, 20 Glamorgan Quakers had been arrested after they refused to swear the oath of allegiance to the new king. As these Quakers saw it, to do so would break the third commandment, "Thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain." At the same time, Quakers in Radnorshire had their meeting for worship broken up when soldiers raided the premises and maltreated them. It comes as no surprise that the short-lived fifth monarchist uprising of Thomas Venner of January 1661 led to a fervent belief that Quakers were involved, or at least were dangerous malcontents. And the level of persecution was so severe at this time that the very name of Quaker exposed the person to the loss of liberty, or worse. In the case of John Husband of Carmarthenshire, he was savagely beaten and nearly had his nose cut off. The penal code from 1661 onwards was used to punish the disaffected, while restored magistrates and clergymen now sought once and for all to outlaw dissent, to silence it. Many Quakers also faced considerable financial losses from fines and the seizure of lands and goods. For many, this was for the non-payment of 1/10 of their income or produce, the tithe, to the parish clergy, while they suffered imprisonment if they failed to comply with all the new laws that the Restoration government had ushered in. All Quakers, whatever their social status, were imperiled. Despite the risks, Quaker records, especially their Great Book of Sufferings, are stuffed full of examples of their opposition to tithes, their refusal to swear oaths, and the details of the brutality of soldiers, constables, magistrates, and jailers. As dissenters, Quakers also naturally refused to attend a church service on a Sunday, preferring instead to gather in their own meetings. Significantly after 1660, many Quakers began to accept a peace testimony and would only offer passive resistance to their opponents. The first action taken against dissenters, and thereby Quakers, was the implementation of the Corporation Act. This measure barred any person from municipal office unless they were prepared to swear the oath of allegiance and receive the sacrament in church services. A decade later, the Test Act stipulated that crown appointments would only be available to known parishioners who again swore allegiance to the king. Specifically drawn up to undermine the spread of Quakerism, the Quaker Act was intended to outlaw their meetings. The Act allowed no more than 5 people above the age of 16 to assemble for worship. This sounds like Cardiff on a Friday night. The first 2 offences incurred fines and/or imprisonment, while a third offence made Quakers liable for transportation. Between 1664 and 1670, life was made even more difficult by the Conventicle Acts, which prohibited Quakers gathering in conventicles, basically their meeting houses. The 5 Mile Act, which in Wales I think we can fully appreciate today, restricted their movement, while paid informers kept the authorities aware of their supposed subversive activities. In March 1674, David Morris, a well-known informer, was instrumental in disrupting a Quaker meeting in Montgomeryshire. It was alleged that Thomas Lloyd, a respectable member of the gentry, had spoken about the nature of true religion and worship. His high social status meant little, as he was a Quaker and therefore beyond the pale, and he was subsequently fined £20 for contravening the Conventicle Act. 2 years after Thomas Lloyd's arrest, 9 Merionethshire Quakers, including 2 women, were imprisoned after being indicted for recusancy or non-attendance at church service. Among those who were charged was Rowland Ellis, again a well-to-do gentleman. At the Ballor Assizes, the magistrates, Kenrick Eighton and Thomas Walcott, were prepared to execute the 9 Quakers for their failure to attend established church services and significantly for refusing to swear the necessary oaths. Although the Quakers had expressed their loyalty to the crown, they would not take the oath of allegiance. In response, the magistrates tried to revive heresy laws passed against the Lollards in 1399 and various other acts from the Elizabethan period onwards. And they also warned the Quakers that they could be tried for treason. Ultimately, this meant that the men would be hanged and quartered, while the women would be burnt at the stake. So what is the context for this? Clearly, there were heightened political tensions, both regionally and nationally at this time. But the interplay of local anxieties concerning these religious radicals in their communities, and specifically in their families, played an important role. So the question that can be asked, was persecution more about personal animus rather than state hostility? At their second court appearance in September, the 9 Quakers again refused to swear and were imprisoned as traitors. They were denied any materials to light a fire, and an elderly Quaker, Edward Rees, was unable to bear the severity of the cold and died that winter. He was one of 5 Quakers to die in prison. The House of Commons later reprieved the others, and the magistrates were censured for their harshness. Thus, throughout the first 3 decades of their existence, Quakers were hounded in their communities and often unable to conduct their religious meetings. But there were brief periods of relief, notably the Declaration of Indulgence in 1672, while persecution was determined by the animus of local clergymen or magistrates to inflict harm or to rabble rounds. However, there were occasions when these peaceable Quakers could deliberately provoke a reaction. The disruption of the clergy during their sermons or disputing theological points in churchyards, as well as in print, alongside the wider concern for public disorder when an itinerant missionary spoke to an assembled crowd, often led to a violent response. As Evan Jones suggested in 1672, the priests of all sorts have told the people that the Quakers were deceivers, and upon that account, they have stirred the magistrates to persecute them in a most horrible manner. But to what extent was such a reaction prompted by the action of Quakers? Did they taunt the authorities? A Quaker Handbill, an unusual gift to any historian, from 1680, written by Richard Hanbury, a wealthy Quaker from Pontypool, was not tame. And I think Hannah is going to quite like this. His publication of a prose disputation between the local clergy and the Quakers was one thing, but to suggest that the clergymen, Anglican clergymen, were half Protestants and half Papists, preaching in the Pope's temple for cursed tithes, and that those who collected tithes were the servants of the Antichrist, was calculated to infuriate Hanbury's adversaries. The immediate context for this was the alleged Popish plot of 1678 to 79, where Quakers again came under severe attack from the authorities. This time, they were suspected of being Papists themselves. It is not surprising, therefore, that Hanbury sought to rebut such allegations, or rather turn the table on his would-be assailants. In contrast, the ecclesiastical authorities sought to impose uniformity of worship, while the civil authorities desired to make the Quakers conform to the letter of the law. If the Quakers failed to comply, then they would be treated as either outsiders or, far more seriously, as traitors. Other punitive measures taken against them were intended to ruin them financially, to restrict their movement, and ultimately to curtail their perceived destabilizing influence. After years of repression, attacks upon their ministers and meeting houses, lengthy jail sentences, and the desecration of graves of former members, some Quakers concluded that their only hope of salvation was to relocate to the American colonies. By so doing, they were determined to liberate themselves from discrimination by establishing a separate community in Pennsylvania, where they could practice their own cultural values and belief system. Now, before I take you across the Atlantic, at least metaphorically, I would like to dwell a little more on the issue of tithes and draw your attention to a document which provides evidence of intolerance post-1689, and to consider these three questions. In the post-toleration period, tithes were still levied by the clergy, and consequently Quakers continued to lose their most valuable crops. Quaker tradespeople would also lose their most expensive cloth or groceries, while poorer Quakers had their essential household utensils taken. They could not cook, etc. Between 1690 and 1736, an estimated 1,100 Quakers in Britain were prosecuted in the Exchequer Court for the non-payment of tithes. And between 1700 and 1740, more than £167,000 had been taken in fines. So much for toleration. One well-documented case concerns the prosecution of Joshua Williams of Monmouthshire in the Exchequer Court in 1705 for a 40 or £2 tithe demand. William Catchmay seized all his corn and 2 cows to the value of £30. The fine was £2, but he distrained £30. The following month, Catchmay returned and sequestered hay and straw, leaving Williams with nothing. In terms of personal animus, the Catchmay family intended making a sacrifice of one of the Quakers. Yet despite being financially ruined, Joshua Williams challenged the clergyman to clear himself from being unmerciful, covetous, or an extortioner, and to explain where in the Bible the clergy were called to ruin honest and industrious people for the non-payment of tithes. Nevertheless, the burden of tithes weighed heavily, and potential imprisonment naturally led many Welsh Quakers, including Williams, to emigrate to Pennsylvania. He left in 1711. Now, for the final part of this summary of Welsh Quakerism and liberty, I was asked to consider Pennsylvanian Welsh attitudes towards slavery, and here I will post a further 3 questions. In a series of manumissions recorded by the Philadelphia Quarterly Meeting between 1765 and 1799, Pennsylvania Quakers and those who are 2nd or 3rd generation Welsh immigrants among them gradually released their slaves from bondage. The history of slavery in colonial and post-colonial America is certainly well known, but the manumission of slaves by these Pennsylvanian Welsh Quakers, men and women, is not sufficiently covered. Indeed, these accounts are submerged in the wider observations that are made concerning the calls for an end to slavery, produced from the late 17th century onwards, the gradual release of slaves, and the significant number of manumissions that were made in the second half of the 18th century. These manumissions provide considerable information about the slaveholder and the slaves, the names and the precise location of the farmsteads, while the age and often the health status of the slave is given. When this is combined with additional information from probates, meeting minutes, and other records, a deeper appreciation can be offered concerning those who had perpetuated slavery, the attempts to change this awful trade in human beings, and how slaves were eventually released. Now, to give you some historical context, there had certainly been appeals to review the condition of slaves in the British colonies, most notably in a letter to the governor of Barbados in 1671, a letter that was partially written by George Fox. And the American colonies, there were similar requests to ameliorate the condition of slaves or to release them. In 1688, Germantown Quakers in Pennsylvania explained the inhuman practice of holding slaves. And 8 years later, others brought the matter to the attention of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. Among those who questioned the slave trade was the Welsh-born Cadwallader Morgan. In July 1696, Morgan, now a resident of Merion Township, explained in a letter to the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting how he had deliberated for 2 years on the purchase of slaves to help him manage his farmstead, and how he had assessed the potential risks. Would the slaves be difficult to control, or would they simply run away? And if they were caught, would they require physical correction? As a Quaker pacifist, how would he deal with that? Secondly, how would he deal with leaving his home? What would happen to the slaves? Would his female servants be safe from any sexual advances? He was aware that they might commit wickedness, in his own words. Now, advice from his Quaker neighbors was rather mixed. Some said buy, while others suggested he should resist the temptation to buy slaves. In a quandary, he sought divine help, which led him to conclude that the purchase of slaves, for him at least, was wrong. Now, what follows is rather interesting. He decided he would not have slaves on any account, and this perplexed those who had offered advice and annoyed others, especially when Morgan made his deliberations public. Yet he did not criticize those who had slaves. He wrote, "I have nothing in my heart against any particular that buys them." He simply asked them to think again on the matter. In September 1696, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting responded to his letter. They called on Quakers not to participate in the pernicious slave trade and requested them to allow their slaves to attend meetings for worship. Now, this simply reiterated the same advice that George Fox had given 20 years earlier in the letter to the governor of Barbados, so nothing simply was changing. But this half measure was clearly not enough, and certainly the Pennsylvanian Welsh continued to hold slaves for several more decades. It would take John Woolman's Some Considerations on the Keeping of Negroes, published in 1754, for the momentum to free slaves to become unstoppable. Still other Quakers, including Welsh ones, continued to own slaves even then, or were involved in the slave trade. And between 1757 and 1776, various disciplinary cases were brought before the quarterly meeting. Significantly, in 1774, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting declared that Quakers who owned slaves would now be disowned. Although there were cases when Pennsylvanian Welsh Quakers had released their slaves in the first half of the 18th century, these were not regular occurrences. Wider efforts were made in the colony in the second half of the 18th century, and I hope I have time for one last example. On the 8th of February 1776, John Lewis of Haverford Township agreed to free his 28-year-old slave Fortin. The terms of his relief were such that Lewis's subsequent heirs had to accept that this was a matter of fact. Not only was Fortin released, but there was to be no future claim as to his person or to any estate that he might accrue. John Lewis was to emphasize that Fortin, his former slave, was to be free, absolutely free, and was to enjoy his liberty unmolested. Furthermore, this private declaration was to be publicly acknowledged and recorded by the Haverford Monthly Meeting. What is noticeable is that there is no mention of any reparations or any provision for the recently released slave. So how would 14 initially survive? And I'm certain I can come back to that in the question and answer session. Lewis was nevertheless not alone in recognizing that the ownership of slaves was immoral and that it could no longer be a prominent part of the transatlantic economy. This needs to be said in the context of the period where justice, liberty, and equality were routinely uttered words in the 13 colonies. These were serious subjects that by the time of 14's release from slavery had already led to a revolution and would see Americans break free from colonial rule. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Richard, and thank you very much also to people who've been putting questions in the chat as well. And please can I ask that you continue to do that if you'd like to, because we've certainly got questions that relate to Hannah's paper, for example. So if we, so I'm just doing a quick check there, yeah. We had some interesting points as well that aren't so much questions that are points, like Holly Russell Allison suggests that that Marion Eames's novel, yes, which I've heard of as well, actually, I think I read it as well. Secret Room, as I know it in English, was turned into a television drama and a follow-up novel as well, which does have kind of overlap with thinking about Quakers in Wales. So that's a really interesting point, Holly, thank you, for people who aren't aware of that novel. And someone else, Amanda Peters, talks about putting in a plug for work to restore Thomas Gunter's home in Abergavenny and share the story of recusancy in Wales more widely. That's fantastic. There's a link there. That's brilliant. So if people would like to click on the link, maybe look at it later, but click on the link now so you've got it. You can have a look at that. So that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you. We've also got some questions. As I say, I'm sure more will come in. People are generally congratulating both speakers on really, really fascinating papers. As I say, I think more questions are likely to come in for Richard. For Hannah, really, really good questions, really interesting questions. And I apologise if I've jotted them down and I've somehow misunderstood. If I've misunderstood, please tell me that I've misunderstood. One initial question by Rosemary was, where is Cwm? Sorry, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. The place in the south on the border with England that you described, Hannah. Where, you know, could you give us some more details of where that is?
Yeah, it's in between Hereford and Monmouth. So if you're familiar with that kind of borderlands of Wales and England, so it's about 12 miles south of Hereford and about, I think, 4 or 5 miles north of Monmouth. So it's kind of in the middle. It's pretty much on the border between Herefordshire, Monmouthshire and Gloucestershire. It's very close to the border for all three of those. Llanrothel is the nearest town, I think, and it's not too far from Skenfrith and from Raglan. It's in that kind of, that part of Wales. And as I said earlier, it's technically in England, but the garden abuts the English border, so the house is in England. It's one of 3 houses which are all in England, and then the Welsh border is immediately runs along the garden effectively. So I think even today, when you're in that kind of part of the world, it's never quite clear if you're in Wales or England. I think it depends who you ask and where you are when you ask the question. So I think it's a really crucial choice of location for that reason.
That's brilliant, thank you. And another question which was raised by Jean Sylvan Evans, and I'm sorry, Jean, this is kind of my summary of your questions. If I've misunderstood, please let me know. But I think my understanding of your question is, did a lack of material available in the Welsh language mean that the Protestant Reformation didn't do that well in Wales until we get to the period of the Methodist revival?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know a huge amount about the Protestant Reformation in Wales itself, but I would say probably, based on what I've seen in the Catholic example. So as I mentioned at the start, that shift between the anti-Jesuit, the kind of Jesuits being very anti-Welsh feeling, that started to change when a Welsh-speaking Jesuit was sent into Wales. So I think there was certainly an awareness amongst the Catholic community, the Jesuit missionaries, that being able to communicate with people in their own language was the way to success. And there's certainly a long tradition of Welsh Catholic manuscript material. Robert Gwynn, for example, in the 1570s is producing, he smuggles a printing press into a cave on the Llŷn Peninsula, I think, and he's printing off material in the Welsh language. So there certainly is a long tradition in the Catholic example of material available in the Welsh language. And it's seen as, Welsh is the language of Catholicism in this period. So I think you could probably extend that example, and the opposite would be true, that if there isn't the Welsh example, then perhaps that is a reason. But what I don't know for sure is how unsuccessful the Protestant Reformation is, because there are certainly, as Richard was just talking about, there are pockets of other non-conformist religions as well. That's certainly something to look into. So I would say probably is the answer. And there are certainly examples of the reverse being true in the Catholic example.
If I could come on to that as well, Erin, if that's okay with you. In the terms of the longer Protestant Reformation, Welsh Quakers, there is very little information relating to the use of the Welsh language, so that the Quaker movement in Wales is largely an English orientated movement. The minutes of meetings, various other records are virtually, I'd say 99% in English. However, with a caveat to that is the fact that in their meetings, there are cases where Welsh is used and recorded, and I'm certain that as a bilingual or maybe even monoglot Welsh speakers, they certainly would have had to use the Welsh language. If I can spiral it back a little bit further, you have to bear in mind that in the early years of the movement, all the missionaries, apart from John Up John and one or two others, were largely English speakers because they came from England. It is only when the indigenous Quaker missionaries were able to go around Wales that they were able to use the Welsh language. The fact that Quakerism is very small, in less than 1% of the population in Wales, and in many respects a lot less than that, means that that they did not penetrate to any great extent, and probably the reason why they did not penetrate the hearts and minds of most Welsh people was due to the fact that they did not really embrace the Welsh language.
I think that does bring up an important point more broadly in the idea of language, and I think it's easy to, because a lot of the sources we have, so from the Catholic example, for example, a lot of the sources that we have are from persecuting authorities, and those are in English if they're secular authorities, or they're in Latin if they're church authorities. And I think that can present a slightly skewed example of how language is being used if the official records themselves are in one language, but actually the on the ground kind of day-to-day stuff might be in a different language that doesn't appear in an official capacity. So I think it's important that raises an important point about just having that in mind when we're dealing with this type of material as well, like the creator of the sources and the language differences as well, I think, and the importance of the use of language on the ground, as it were.
That's great. Richard, would you like to respond to that? Or I've got more questions that have come in the chat. So sorry, is there anything you'd like to add, Richard?
I think that the Quakers were very restricted, as I mentioned, because they really didn't embrace the language. And I think that curtailed their numbers more than anything else. If they had utilized it more, although the evidence is not really there to make any clear, true assessment of what actually was happening on the ground. But they're very, very limited numbers would suggest that they did not penetrate deeply into the Welsh psyche. And I think the lack of the Welsh language is certainly significant. Can I also go back to the initial point that was raised earlier with Marian Eames's novel? Ystafell Thurgoel, The Secret Room, was became a TV series, a 6-part costume drama from S4C. And I was the historical consultant for that, and it was fascinating to see the interpretation of the evidence, first of all by Marian Eames's novels, and secondly by the way that the production company actually utilized that to explain what was happening in the 17th century. I do remember a phone call though, when they asked me very early in the morning to provide some a song that might be used on the back of a cart going to a fair. And I had to ponder this and think what song or what piece of music could be utilized. So I said, give me a couple of hours and I'll come back to you. So I explained to them later that the type of song that might be used was 9 times a night, which was so disgustingly pornographic that I don't think they were able to utilize that. If you are interested in the bawdy nature of the 17th century, that type of thing might have proved to be one of the reasons why Stafydd Thurgoll might have not have been as popular outside of Wales, or certainly if they had utilised it, it might have been a bit more popular in current circumstances.
That's brilliant, thank you. I do like a nice bawdy ballad and song period. That's great. So just to go back to the questions, hugely important, really, really interesting things coming in. There's a question which I feel I should absolutely mention it, because I know you have talked a lot about print, but obviously it's a hugely important topic, because Paul raises a question where he talks about the parallels between the print culture of the Catholics that you've talked about, Hannah, the Welsh Catholics, and also the early Protestant print culture. And obviously there's some overlap in terms of time period. And so I think he's, and Paul, I apologise if I've misunderstood your question, but I think he's sort of talking about possible parallels between the two and possible motivations for both of them. Why is it so important to have a Welsh Catholic print culture? What does that do for Welsh Catholicism?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think in some ways, if you think of the nature of a book, so they're inherently small, that you can hold them in your hands. They're inherently private because they can be closed. So the books that I was talking about, I think I would say 70% of them were the small size. So in libraries, you tend to get the big folio editions, which we've all seen in historical libraries. I'd say between about 25 and 30% of the surviving books are the big, kind of unmanageable sizes. The rest of them are very small, very portable. So we're talking kind of a normal kind of paperback size today in today's equivalent. So therefore they're easy to slip into a pocket. They're easy to slip into a saddlebag. They're easy to disguise in other things. And an unbound book, even just the pages stitched together without a cover, is even easier to slip, underneath other clothes or in other items. And I think it offers a measure of control as well, because you've got the the authorities, the kind of the secular and the ecclesiastical authorities saying, that all the laws and the various restrictions that we've talked about. And I think it kind of offers you a chance to control the narrative yourself. If you're able to read the words of your people of your faith in their words, and you're able to read that yourself rather than have somebody else's interpretation of it, you're able to kind of read it yourself and to form your own opinions on it rather than rely on an opposing authority's version of it. I think there's a convenience element, there's a narrative element, and this is a time as well in history, it's important to remember, where the book as a technology is really kind of everywhere. It's the equivalent of the internet in the 1980s compared to the internet today. You've got the kind of the advent of print in the late 15th century, which gradually becomes more and more available. So initially books are very monastic, they're very expensive, they're very limited to the elite people who can afford to have them made and who can afford to own them. And by the time we get to the 17th century, books are commonplace. They're most people can afford to buy a book. Most people want to own books, and literacy is increasing. So the book as a technology itself is one that's kind of increasing rapidly at this point as well. So it's kind of harnessing modern technology and using it for your own ends as well as everything else.
Sorry, brilliant, thank you. I mean, Richard, would you like to add anything to that, thinking about the print culture of Quakerism?
Quakers are extremely literate individuals, to say the least. And so they, even in Wales during this time where print culture is certainly picking up in the 17th century, Quakers used the print culture largely in English, predominantly in English, to disseminate their views, but also to further their cause against those who were persecuting them. So when there is a disputation, the disputation wouldn't just be that verbal onslaught in a churchyard or in a market square. It would be translated into written text, and the text would take the issues further forward. But I warn you, if you do read some of these, they can go on and on and on. The Quakers can be extremely verbose, to say the least. But they're not just correcting some of the misinterpretations about themselves. I gave you the example of Richard Hanbury trying to persuade people by a local meeting that they weren't papists, but there are others whereby they fundamentally want to show that they are the true Protestants, they are the true Christians, they are the inheritors of the apostles. So they are trying to establish themselves in a much more forcible way than they can just do via oral means. And the final point on that is that the small books, these disputations or sections of them, can be read to those who would be illiterate. So the missionaries can further read the text to those who might be willing adherents.
Brilliant.
Can I just add there as well, Erin? I think for those who are perhaps not familiar with print technology at this point, it's worth just remembering the physical act of creating a book and creating it. So there's a level of commitment kind of inherent in that, because today we type on our computers and we press print and it's done. It seems like a very easy process, but at this point we're talking about a big printing press. We're talking about physically putting every single letter into a tray of the pressing the pages, putting the paper through, stitching the book together. So the physical act as a material culture object, there's an implied commitment to your cause and to the words that you're sharing in the physical creation of a book as well. I think it's easy to forget that in our modern day of, it's fairly easy and books are, everywhere, aren't they? It's easy to print things and create things. It's important to remember that bit as well, I think.
Can I come back on that as well? There's the utilization of the network, particularly in Quakers, of the networks that they're creating throughout Wales and England, particularly the utilization of printers in Shrewsbury, sometimes in Bristol, although it's not truly evident, but especially in London, and the transportation of these small texts in their thousands could be brought by chapbook sellers throughout Wales. So I'm wondering if that's the same with Catholics in Wales as well.
Yeah, so I think there are not as many print editions from British presses. The Catholic works tend to have come from the continental Catholic presses, but there are some examples of existing printers being used to print presses. As you said, they're easily portable from around England and Wales. And I think you do see at key points the Catholics kind of trying to that element of controlling the narrative that I mentioned. They establish their own printing presses. So there's Robert Gwynne's printing press in the Llŷn Peninsula in the 1570s. When Edmund Campion, who's one of the early Jesuit missionaries, arrives in England in 1580, one of the first things he does is establish a printing press. So I think he's got friends in the printing industry who have an old press that they don't need anymore, that they're willing to give to him, which he sets up in a barn and then uses that to produce his work, which is then distributed physically around the network. So the idea of having a printing press, whether that's sort of, you know, a friendly person who's kind of going slipping things under the counter, or your own printing press is a key element in that.
Bro, that's fantastic, and I think it really does speak to the dedication of the people involved, that people are buying printing presses, setting them up in barns, setting them up in caves. It's absolutely extraordinary. I've got a question, and probably the final question, I think, which could possibly also relate to Quakers, although it is ostensibly about, well, it is specifically, I should say, not ostensibly, about Catholics. Aled's question, although I realise there's also a question from Simon Parsons as well. Aled's question about how subversive were Catholic networks in attempting to undermine the state. I appreciate it's a huge question. Undermine the state in the late 16th century, beginning of the 17th centuries.
Yeah, I mean, I think with any group that's outside of the law, where there's always going to be people who are more who are pushing for a more extreme reaction, and people who are happy to kind of, you know, find a way to exist secretly. I think with the Welsh Catholics, for example, there's an interesting point in May 1605, which hasn't really received much attention. So it's ostensibly a row about burial rights. There's a Welsh lady called Alice something, I can't remember what her surname is now, but a small parish in Monmouthshire. She dies, and her neighbours wanted to be buried as a Catholic. They effectively pull the vicar out of his vicarage and tell him that they're going to do a Catholic burial, whether he likes it or not. And then this leads to this kind of really well organised kind of a riot against the anti-Catholic legislation. So it's as if everything was ready and waiting for the spark to be lit. So there's this huge kind of protest. Lots of men with arms come from various villages and towns all along the marches, and start kind of marching on Hereford, so marching against the ecclesiastical authority. And then this gets completely overshadowed by the events of November 1605, understandably. But there's a real kind of sense of worry, and they're really well organised. The English authorities really start to panic that the Welsh Catholics are doing what they've kind of been threatening to do for the last however many years. And they send their very Protestant friend, the Earl of Worcester, down to Wales to sort them out, which I think was slightly short-sighted, given what I was saying earlier about his secret life. But that sense from the authorities that Wales is a bit of a powder keg, and if the spark appears at the right time, then this going to cause them real problems in terms of the kind of Protestant legitimacy and their authority. And I think there's this real sense that it needs to be handled, you know, very carefully and very diplomatically. And there's certainly later on in the Popish plot, Wales is one of the few areas in the whole of the UK that suffers. It suffers the worst out of all of the main areas. So we often hear about Lancashire as being this kind of hotbed of Catholicism, but actually there are more priests executed in Wales in 1679 than anywhere else combined, I think. So it's like the authorities have kind of taken their opportunity to get rid of, you know, things that they've been aware of for a long time. So I think there's certainly it's something that needs more work done on it, but there is certainly this sense that the authorities are very, very worried about what could potentially happen if the right pieces are in place in Wales, and the impact that could have on them.
Brilliant, thank you. I think at this point I absolutely have to hand over to Ian, but to say, as I'm sure Ian will say as well, there will be a few minutes kind of right at the end, so additional questions, for example, relating to the question asked by Simon, apologies Simon, around books as being prestige items. That's something that hopefully can be kind of addressed if you've got time to wait for sort of a few moments beyond the kind of scheduled time at which this is meant to end. So if I can pass back over to Ian now, please.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Erin. Thanks very much for chairing today's session, and to Richard and Hannah for offering us such thought-provoking perspectives on the often complex boundaries between religion and liberty. Some brilliant primary illustrative material used to enrich both fascinating talks. Thanks so much, both. Many thanks also to you, the audience, for your comments and questions via the chat function. As Erin just mentioned, if anyone would like to stay on Zoom after the event for an informal chat or to ask further questions to our speakers, you'd be most welcome. Thank you. One more important thank you. Many thanks to James, Sean, Darren, Morwenna, Matthew, for their help in organising and publicising this event. As I mentioned at the start, today's session is the second in part 2 of our spring series online events on migration in Wales. I very much hope you'll join us for session 3, which will be held next Saturday, on this occasion at the new time of 2 p.m, if you note that in your diaries, to accommodate the different time zones of our speakers. We've got somebody zooming in from, one of our speakers from Tennessee, and which will be entitled, "If There's No Struggle, There's No Progress, the Atlantic Abolitionist Movement and Wales." The event will be chaired by Darren Macy, and our guest speakers will be Richard Blackett, Jen Wilson and Daniel Williams. As usual, details about to sign up for the event can be found on our website and also on Llafur's Twitter and Facebook pages, and they will also be emailed out to members in the coming week. As I know most of you are aware by now, if you missed any of our previous online events, recordings of all sessions from 2020 summer series and part 1 of our 2021 spring series are available via the Llafur website. Recordings of part 2 events will also be uploaded there in due course. If you want to go onto our website to access these, you may want to look at under our membership tab, where you'll find details of how to become a Llafur member if you're not already one. It only remains for me to say thank you once again for your support, and we look forward to welcoming you back next Saturday at our new time of 2 p.m. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you.